wilderness does not unfurl its arms in welcome. It hums a subtler, more insidious melody. Vastness that seeps into your marrow, solitude that coils tight around your throat, air sharp with the tang of pine and secrets older than the mountains that cradle them. For some, it's a sanctuary, a chance to peel away the clamor of a life grown too shrill, too crowded. For others, it's a crucible, a gauntlet where nature's indifference dares you to stand unbowed. But what happens when that indifference curdles into malice? When the rustle of leaves sharpens into a hiss? When the shadows stretch with intent? When the wild turns its gaze upon you with eyes too ancient, too ravenous, to belong to any beast we've named? These are not fables woven from campfire embers, nor the fevered conjurings of a sleepless mind. These are true accounts, clawed from the trembling memories of those who ventured into America's forests seeking respite, only to find themselves ensnared by forces that defy the boundaries of reason. From Michigan's shadowed pines to Montana's jagged peaks, these four stories are bound by a single, unyielding thread. The moment the wilderness becomes predator, leaving behind its relics, bones scattered like broken oaths, tracks pressed into the earth like taunts, screams swallowed by the trees, that whisper truths too vast, too primal, to silence. This is no mere recounting. This is an excavation of the hollows, a descent into the places where maps fray and shadows take root. Step carefully, reader, listener. The wild is awake, and it knows your scent. The Porcupine's Bone Vault, Elias Crowley, Michigan, 2016. Elias Crowley's hands were steady as iron, his eyes keen as a hawk's, tools honed by years as a freelance cartographer who, at 32 in the spring of 2016, thrived on stitching the wild into neat lines on a page. The Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park in Michigan's Upper Peninsula was his latest canvas, a contract to map remote trails for a hiking app blending his meticulous craft with the thrill of solitude. He carried the essentials: a GPS unit blinking faintly in the gloom, paper maps curling at the edges from damp air, a compass that gleamed dully under the muted light filtering through ancient hemlocks, and a pack of supplies: canned food, water, a battered notebook, slung over his broad shoulder. Friends called him a planner, a man who left little to chance, his mind a grid of coordinates and contingencies. He'd mapped forests from Maine to Oregon, tracing paths where others saw only chaos, his boots worn thin by trails few dared to tread. But no amount of preparation, no grit of foresight, could brace him for the shadow that awaited in those old-growth woods, where the earth itself seemed to exhale a warning, a breath too old to be merely wind. The night before, he'd pitched his tent alone, miles from the park's well-trodden paths, a speck in a sea of towering pines and maples whose roots clawed through the rugged, glacier-scarred terrain. The Porcupine Mountains, named for their bristling silhouette against the sky, sprawled across 60,000 acres, a labyrinth of steep ridges and hidden valleys carved by ice ages long past. Elias's campsite was a clearing barely large enough for his tent, the ground soft with moss and pine needles, the air crisp with the promise of spring. The rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl had lulled him into a restless sleep, his breath fogging in the chill as he dreamt of lines and bearings, the forest a puzzle he could solve. Morning broke with a gray, unyielding sky, the canopy a woven shroud that dimmed the sun to a faint glow, casting the underbrush, ferns slick with dew, thorns snagging at his pant legs, into perpetual twilight. He struck camp methodically, folding his tent with the precision of a man who trusted order, and ventured deeper, his boots sinking into the loamy earth of an unmarked trail, a threadbare path half swallowed by time and neglect, its edges blurred by encroaching roots and brambles. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp soil and pine resin, a thick, living perfume that clung to his flannel as he hacked through the undergrowth with a small machete, its blade dulled by years of use but still sharp enough to part the green curtain before him. Around mid-morning, the trees parted abruptly, and a clearing stopped him cold. A perfect circle of bare dirt, no grass, no weeds, just a stark, unnatural void in the forest's embrace. In its center stood a pile of rocks, stacked with a precision that defied the chaos of nature. Not a hiker's cairn, those haphazard markers of passage, but something older, deliberate, its edges too sharp, too intentional, as if placed by hands that knew no hurry. "Weird," he muttered, his voice a jagged shard in the stillness, snapping a photo with his phone, its flash a brief flare against the gloom. He noted the coordinates in his notebook, the numbers a tether to sanity, though unease prickled his skin, a faint itch he couldn't scratch. He wasn't superstitious. Years in the wild had shown him stranger things, from makeshift altars of twigs and feathers to abandoned lawn chairs rusting in the undergrowth, relics of human eccentricity lost to the forest's patient reclamation. This was just another oddity, he told himself, a quirk of some long-gone wanderer, though the silence around it felt heavier, as if the clearing held its breath, waiting. An hour later, the forest's chatter, birds trilling from the canopy, insects buzzing in the underbrush, squirrels skittering through the branches, died abruptly, leaving a silence so thick it pressed against his skull like a vice. The absence was palpable, a void where life should have thrived, and his pulse quickened, though he forced his steps onward, his machete a steady rhythm against the thorns. Then he saw it. A deer, or what remained of one, sprawled across the path like a grotesque offering. Its body was gutted, entrails glistening wetly in the dim light filtering through the boughs, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle, nearly 180 degrees. Back legs torn clean off as if ripped by a force beyond reason. The wounds were jagged, not the clean slice of a hunter's blade nor the sloppy tear of a bear's claws, but something chaotic, deliberate, the flesh shredded with a precision that hinted at intent. "What the hell did this?" he rasped, pulling his shirt over his mouth against the overpowering stench of rot and blood, his stomach lurching as he crouched beside the carnage. He noted the absence of scavenger tracks, no crows pecking at the remains, no foxes drawn to the feast, nothing to disturb the stillness of the kill. A scraping sound, claws dragging across bark, echoed from the trees ahead, sharp and close, and he froze, scanning the gloom with eyes that betrayed his growing dread. Claw marks scarred the trunks, deep grooves 10 feet high, too precise for a cougar's casual swipe, too vast for a bear's broad paws. Patches of underbrush lay flattened in wide swaths, as if something massive had shouldered through, indifferent to the thorns that snagged at Elias's own sleeves, leaving faint tears in the fabric. Paranoia crept in, a cold sweat beating beneath his collar as every twig snapped, every gust of wind through the leaves, felt like a prelude to something unspeakable. He muttered to himself, cracking dark jokes. "Come on, Crowley, you've seen enough horror flicks to know this is how it starts. Don't trip over your own damn feet." His voice a frail shield against the mounting unease, though it trembled at the edges, betraying him. The forest felt alive now, not with the hum of life but with a presence, a weight that pressed against his chest, slowing his breath. Then, a scream shattered the silence. Not human, yet not wholly animal, a guttural, piercing wail laced with rage that twisted his stomach into knots, reverberating through the trees until it seemed to claw at the sky itself. It came from his left, deep in the forest's shadowed heart, and against every ounce of common sense. He turned toward it, drawn by a stubborn curiosity he'd later curse as folly. Maybe someone needs help, he told himself, a lie to steady his trembling hands as he pushed through the thickening undergrowth, the canopy choking out the light until he moved in near dusk, his flashlight a weak beam against the encroaching dark. 10 minutes felt like hours, each step heavier, the air growing colder, damper, until he found the second body. A man slumped against a tree, torso shredded as if run through a wood chipper, his face locked in a mask of sheer terror, eyes wide and unseeing, pupils dilated into black pools. His jacket bore the logo of a local hiking group, Upper Peninsula Trailblazers, stitched in faded yellow. He wasn't a novice, not some city fool lost in the wild, but a man who knew these woods, who'd walked them with confidence. His pack lay a few feet away, contents scattered, maps torn into jagged strips, a water bottle punctured as if by claws, a flashlight cracked open, its batteries spilling into the dirt. Elias checked for a pulse, a futile gesture, the man's skin cold as the earth beneath him, his wrist limp, lifeless. The scraping returned, louder, closer, a sound that clawed at his nerves like nails on glass. Then, bursting through the trees to his right, it emerged. Massive, easily the size of a grizzly yet leaner, gaunt, its fur matted and patchy as if burned or scarred, limbs too long, joints bending in ways that screamed wrongness to his cartographer's eye, trained to measure proportion and balance. Its head was a nightmare. A wolf's snout stretched grotesquely, jaws bristling with jagged teeth too large for its skull, eyes glinting with a cold, calculating malice that rooted him to the spot. It stopped, head snapping toward him, and Elias's breath caught as its gaze pinned him like prey, those eyes not merely animal but aware, weighing him, judging. Then it charged, a blur of sinew and fury, its speed a violation of its bulk, and he bolted, legs pumping through the underbrush, branches slashing his face, drawing thin lines of blood across his cheeks. Claws raked his chest, a searing pain that nearly dropped him, the fabric of his flannel tearing as easily as paper, but he swung a thick branch he'd snatched from the ground, the wood splintering against its frame with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. It barely flinched, lunging again, its breath a rancid wave of decay and wet fur, and he scrambled, grabbing a rock, jagged, heavy, and smashing it against its skull. A desperate blow that staggered it, its snarl twisting into a pained wheeze long enough for him to flee. He veered off the trail, crashing into a stream, the icy water soaking him to the waist, masking his scent as he splashed downstream, praying the current would confuse the thing's pursuit. Blood seeped through his shirt, warm and sticky against the cold, his chest burning with every ragged breath, until he collapsed behind a boulder, the forest's silence his only companion as minutes stretched into hours, the sound of his own heartbeat a deafening roar in his ears. He stumbled back to civilization, half dead, his flannel a tattered rag, blood caking his hands, reporting the horror to authorities who nodded politely but dismissed him as shaken, delusional, a man undone by the wild's harshness. Probably a bear, they said, though their eyes avoided his, their pens scratching notes they'd never follow up. A week later, hikers stumbled on a cave deep in the Porcupine Mountains. Bones littered its floor, some animal, others unmistakably human, dozens scattered like forgotten relics across the damp stone, some still slick with marrow, others bleached by time. The area was sealed, labeled a safety hazard, details buried under bureaucratic hush, a press release citing geological instability that fooled no one who'd heard the whispers. Elias quit mapping soon after, trading his compass for a desk job in a city whose concrete walls promised no shadows could stretch so long. The wild's whisper remained a scar he'd carry forever, a jagged line across his chest and a tremor in his hands whenever the wind carried the scent of pine. Evidence unearthed. A deer's twisted corpse, claw marks gouged into bark 10 feet high, a cave brimming with bones both beast and man. What would you do if the wild turned its teeth on you, reader? Could you outrun its gaze? Or would it claim your echo too, leaving your bones to join the silent horde? The Boundary Waters Silent Reaper. Alden Merritt, Minnesota, 2016. Alden Merritt, 37 in the summer of 2016, was a man frayed by the grind of city life. Endless emails piling in his inbox like digital silt, fluorescent lights bleaching the color from his days. A soul burned out by the monotony of a job he'd once loved but now endured. The Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in northern Minnesota offered a lifeline. A chance to reconnect with EMT Farrell, a college friend turned rugged off-grid loner whose texts had dwindled to sporadic birthday greetings over a decade of drift. EMT's invitation was a siren call. Paddle into the wild's remote lakes, fish under a sky unmarred by smog, relive the reckless nights of their youth when they'd stumble from bars laughing, invincible. Alden, desperate for a break, borrowed gear from a coworker. A sleeping bag, a rod, a pack too small for his broad frame. Flew to Duluth and met EMT in Ely, renting a canoe under a sky heavy with stars that seemed to mock the artificial glow he'd fled. His friend's toothy grin and unkempt beard, wilder than Alden remembered, sparked a laugh, a flicker of the old camaraderie that had once bound them through late-night debates and ill-advised bets. Too clean-cut for the wild now, huh? EMT jibed, clapping him on the shoulder, and Alden grinned, though the words stung with half-truth. He'd traded hiking boots for loafers years ago, his hands softened by keyboards, not calloused by paddles. The first day was a balm to his unraveling spirit. They paddled across glassy lakes, the water a mirror of pine-fringed shores that stretched unbroken to the horizon, portaged over rocky trails that bruised their shoulders and left their palms raw, and set camp on a peninsula jutting into a vast expanse of dark water, its surface rippling faintly under a breeze that carried the scent of wet earth and cedar. The boundary waters sprawled over 1,000,000 acres, a maze of interconnected lakes and forests where civilization's hum faded to a memory. Its silence a gift Alden hadn't known he craved. The stars that night blazed, ridiculous in their clarity, pinpricks of light so dense they seemed to crowd the sky, and EMT traced constellations Alden had never known. Cassiopeia's crooked W, Lyra's faint harp. His voice a gravelly thread in the stillness, roughened by months alone. Loons called across the lake, their mournful wails weaving into Alden's dreams as he sank into sleep, muscles pleasantly sore from the day's labor. The ground hard beneath his thin mat but somehow comforting, a reminder of a world that didn't bend to his will. But the second day unraveled the illusion, tearing through the fragile piece he'd begun to stitch together. EMT woke him at dawn, tense, rubbing his neck as he muttered about a sound in the night. Like a moose, but too heavy, too fast, crashing through the trees. Alden chalked it up to imagination, a man too long alone in the wild spooking himself with shadows. But EMT's eyes darted over his shoulder as they paddled that morning. His paddle strokes sharp, uneven, splashing water onto the canoe's hull with a rhythm that betrayed his nerves. Afternoon brought fishing, walleye tugged their lines with stubborn strength. The sun sinking into a bruise of orange and purple across the water, painting the lake in hues that made Alden pause, rod in hand, to breathe it in. They returned to camp as dusk bled into the horizon, the air cooling only to find ruin. The tent slashed open, fabric flapping like a wounded bird caught in a storm. The cooler appended food wrappers scattered across the dirt. Claw marks etched into the nylon, too narrow, too deep for a bear's broad paws, the cuts precise as if made by a blade wielded with malice. EMT swore under his breath, hand on the hunting knife at his belt, its leather sheath worn smooth by years of use, his usual cockiness draining into a grim silence that settled between them like fog. "This isn't right," he growled, crouching to inspect the slashes, his fingers tracing the edges. "Bears go for food. Tear into the cooler. Not this. Look at it, it's like it was playing." Alden suggested kids, a weak theory in the wilderness's isolation. No trails led here, no signs of human passage marred the shore, and EMT's shake of head was a blade cutting through it, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the tree line. "No way. No one's dumb enough to hike out here just to mess with us." Night fell, and they built a fire larger than needed, its flames licking high, casting a frail circle of light against the pressing dark that seemed to pulse beyond it, alive with something they couldn't name. The forest stillness was no longer peaceful but watchful, a weight that smothered their forced chatter. Jokes about college pranks, half-hearted boasts about fish that got away, until their voices faltered, swallowed by the night. Around midnight, a thudding rhythm broke the quiet, footsteps, heavy, deliberate, circling their camp, the sound muffled by pine needles but unmistakable, a cadence too measured for a stumbling beast. Alden whispered EMT's name, his voice barely a breath, and his friend nodded, gripping the knife, eyes glinting with a fear Alden hadn't seen since their wildest college brawls. When EMT had faced down a barroom thug with bravado now stripped away, the sound stopped, leaving a silence that roared in their ears, thicker than before, pressing against their skulls. "Get in the canoe," EMT hissed, voice low and urgent, cutting through the stillness like a shard of glass. "What? Why? Just do it." They scrambled to the water, shoving off with nothing but paddles and the clothes on their backs, the fire flickering on shore as they aimed for a small island in the lake's heart, its rocky silhouette a faint promise of refuge. Alden's arms ached, his breath came in short gasps, but he paddled, the canoe slicing through the dark water, ripples spreading like whispers behind them. A scream tore from the camp, a shrill, guttural wail that dropped Alden's stomach, EMT's paddle freezing mid-stroke, the blade dripping as he stared back. "That's not an animal," he whispered, face pale as moonlight caught the sweat on his brow, his beard stark against his ashen skin. From the island's rocks, they crouched low, watching. A figure emerged near the dying embers, tall, thin, limbs jerking unnaturally like a marionette cut loose, head elongated, canine yet wrong, sniffing the air with a snout that gleamed wetly in the firelight. It plunged into the water, claws slicing the surface, swimming with terrifying ease, its limbs cutting through the lake as if it belonged there. A predator born of both shore and depth. It struck the canoe, nearly tipping it, the hull shuddering under the blow, and EMT swung his knife, slashing its arm. Dark blood sprayed the wood, a slick sheen that glistened in the moonlight. It shrieked, a sound that clawed at Alden's ears, lunging again, claws inches from his head, the air thick with its stench. Rot, wet fur, a metallic tang that coated his tongue. "Go!" EMT yelled, shoving him toward shore, the canoe rocking as Alden stumbled onto the rocks, his boots slipping on wet stone. Behind him, he heard EMT shouting, then a guttural sound, tearing flesh, a splash, and turned just in time to see the creature dragging his friend under, EMT's screams cutting off as the water closed over him, ripples spreading outward, then stilling. Alden ran, legs trembling, the island's jagged terrain tearing at his jeans, until he collapsed on a road miles away, rangers finding him mud-caked and babbling, his eyes hollow with a terror he couldn't name. The canoe was later found shredded. Blood stained the rocks, tracks, wolf-like, impossibly heavy, marched into the trees, too deep for any natural beast. EMT was gone, a ghost in the Boundary Waters lore, where Ojibwe tales whisper of a creature that walks between worlds, drawn to those who trespass too far. Alden never returned, the sound of that scream a shadow that woke him nightly. The stars he'd once marveled at now a cold, accusing glare, evidence unearthed. Slashed tent, blood on rocks, oversized tracks pressed deep into the earth. Would you paddle into the unknown, listener? What price would you pay to flee the wild's grasp, or to save the one beside you? The Deemp's Twisted Hunter, Anonymous Surveyor, Indiana, 2013. The surveyor, 37 in the autumn of 2013, was a man carved by the outdoors, contracted by the Forest Service to bushwhack through Indiana's Charles C. Deem Wilderness, a sprawling 13,000-acre expanse of hardwood hollows and ridges where the land folded into itself like a crumpled map. His job was simple on paper: locate a boundary marker swallowed by decades of undergrowth, confirm its GPS coordinates, flag it for future teams to revisit. His truck waited 3 miles north on a rutted service road, a battered 4x4 parked under a canopy of oaks, its bed cluttered with tools and spare gas cans. His pack was light, a practical load for a day's trek. A topographic map creased from use, a GPS unit flickering under the dense canopy, a machete for hacking through thick brush, a canteen sloshing faintly with water that tasted of metal. He carried no firearm. Black bears roamed the Deem, but they were shy, and territorial bucks posed more bluster than threat. In years of surveying, from the Appalachians to the Midwest's flat expanses, he'd never felt the wild's teeth, never needed more than his wits and a steady hand. The forest was his domain, its rhythms as familiar as his own pulse, until that day, when it turned against him. The morning began with a quiet he'd always found comforting, boots crunching through a carpet of fallen leaves, red and gold against the dark earth, birds chattering faintly from the canopy of hickory and maple, their calls a soft counterpoint to the rustle of branches overhead. The Deem Wilderness, named for a 19th century conservationist, was a patchwork of steep slopes and hidden ravines, its trails fading into thickets where only the determined ventured. He'd started at dawn, the sky a pale wash above the trees, the air cool and damp with the promise of rain that never came. For hours it was uneventful. His machete cleared a path through brambles. His GPS beeped intermittently as the signal faltered. His breath steamed in the chill. But as he pushed deeper, the atmosphere shifted, subtle at first. The bird song faded to a murmur, then ceased. The wind, which had swayed the treetops in gentle gusts, stilled completely. Even the insects, a relentless hum in the underbrush, fell silent. The forest held its breath, and he felt it. a weight pressing against his chest, an unease he couldn't name, though he pressed on, telling himself it was fatigue, the monotony of the task playing tricks. Around midday he found the marker, exactly where the old map promised. A rusted iron post buried under a tangle of roots and moss, its edges pitted by time, a relic of surveys from decades past when the Deem was still logged for timber. He knelt, brushing away the overgrowth, confirming the coordinates with a flicker of satisfaction, then flagged the spot with orange tape that fluttered faintly in the still air. Resting on a fallen log, its bark slick with lichen, he took a swig from his canteen, the water cold against his dry throat. That's when he noticed the tracks in the mud nearby. Too large, too deep, bipedal. Their shape neither canine nor human. The toes elongated, claw impressions gouging the earth. He frowned, crouching to study them, his fingers hovering over the prints. Coyote, he thought, but the size was wrong, the weight too heavy, the stride too deliberate. A prank, maybe, some joker with novelty shoes, but the isolation of the Deem mocked that notion. He laughed, a hollow sound to shake off the unease, and stood, brushing dirt from his knees. But the tracks lingered in his mind, a puzzle he couldn't solve, and as he moved toward the next waypoint, the forest silence grew thicker, a shroud that muffled his footsteps. Not 20 minutes later, he stumbled on the remains of a deer, its carcass torn apart, shredded in a way that was almost surgical, ribs splintered like kindling, organs gone, spine snapped clean in half as if by hands of impossible strength. The flesh was shredded, but the kill was fresh, blood still wet, pooling in the dirt, no drag marks, no evidence of scavengers drawn to the feast. He stood over it, machete dangling at his side, the air thick with a metallic tang that stung his nose, his stomach churning. Alien autopsy, he muttered. A dark joke that died in his throat as the smell overwhelmed him, forcing him to step back. A rhythmic thump shadowed his steps, faint at first, growing louder, closer. A sound like something heavy moving through the underbrush, deliberate, not the shuffle of a bear or the crash of a deer. He backed away, machete clenched in one hand, his other fumbling for the GPS, though its screen flickered uselessly under the canopy's chokehold. Every instinct screamed to run, but he moved steady, brisk. Running in the wild was a broken ankle waiting to happen, and he'd seen enough twisted limbs on the job to know better. Through the trees it appeared. 7 feet tall, fur matted and patchy, limbs elongated beyond reason. Head a warped wolf's with eyes that pierced through the gloom. Yellow, unblinking, alive with a malice that froze his blood. Its snout was narrow, teeth jagged and uneven. Its frame gaunt yet powerful, muscles rippling under scarred skin. A man's scream cut through the silence, raw and terrified, high-pitched, ending in a wet choke that echoed off the ridges. The surveyor moved toward it, torn between flight and a stubborn need to help, and found him. A hiker, chest torn open, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, blood pooling around him, soaking the earth red. The creature stood over the body, muzzle stained, claws glinting in the dappled light, head cocked as if listening. It looked up, locking eyes with him, and lunged, a blur of motion that defied its size. He fled, crashing through brush, branches whipping his face, the thing's footfalls heavy behind him, deliberate, relentless. His lungs burned, legs screamed, but he reached his truck, diving in, slamming the door as the engine roared to life. In the rearview, he glimpsed it at the clearing's edge, watching, head tilted, as if amused by his escape. Rangers found the deer, but the man's body vanished, dragged off into the woods. 2 hikers went missing a week later, their camp shredded, tracks fading into the hollows, bipedal, clawed, too large for reason. The surveyor quit soon after, the forest's silence a weight he couldn't shake, the memory of those eyes a shadow that followed him into the flatlands. Evidence unearthed. Tracks too deep for any beast. A deer's surgical ruin. A missing corpse swallowed by the wild. Could you map the wild's edge? Reader, what would you flee from or toward in its shadowed hollows? The Ipsarca's Gray Phantom. Tobias Crane, Montana, 2009. Tobias Crane, a backcountry ranger in Montana's Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness in the summer of 2009, was a man forged by solitude, stationed at Sable Tower, a 1940s fire lookout perched on a high ridge overlooking the Yellowstone River Valley, its weathered planks creaking under every step. At 34, he'd spent years patrolling the wild, his skin tanned by sun and wind, his hands calloused from axe and rope, his father's words, "You've got a knack for finding trouble in the woods," a prophecy he'd laughed off until that August. His job was unglamorous but vital. Monitor for fires, maintain trails, guide lost hikers back to safety, all from a tower that offered a panoramic view of jagged peaks, deep valleys, and dense forests stretching to the horizon. The Absaroka-Beartooth, a million-acre sprawl of untamed land, was a maze few braved, its trails fading into scree and thickets where even seasoned backpackers tread warily. Tobias carried a knife at his belt, a Marlin 30-30 slung over his shoulder. Grizzly country demanded it, and a radio that spat more static than signal, a lifeline as unreliable as the weather. The day it went sideways started innocently. A clear sky, the kind that made the loneliness of the tower fade, the air sharp with pine and the faint tang of wood smoke from a distant campfire. He'd spent the morning clearing debris from a trail near the tower, his axe biting into fallen branches, sweat beading under his ranger cap, and returned by early afternoon, brewing lukewarm coffee over a small stove. The radio crackled alive, a woman's voice spilling out, shaky, breathless, words tumbling over each other. "This is Dana Mallister. Something's following us near Slough Creek." Not someone, something. Her fear was thick, a raw edge that cut through the static, though the connection faltered before he could ask more. He grabbed his pack, strapped on his knife, slung the rifle over his shoulder, an unwritten rule among rangers, protection against the wild's teeth, and tried radioing Harris, his colleague on a 3-day patrol, but the signal died in the vastness. Dispatch was a joke that far out, backup a fantasy, so he set off alone, the 2-hour hike to Slough Creek a brisk march through pine and boulder, the sun dipping low, throwing long shadows that clawed across the earth. He found their campsite easily. A mess of torn fabric and scattered gear, one tent slashed open as if by a blade, its nylon flapping in the faint breeze. Blood stained the dirt, not a flood but enough to tighten his stomach, a few smears glinting wetly in the fading light. Tracks circled the site, oversized, wolf-like, yet oddly spaced, as if the thing had walked upright, claws digging deep into the soil. He'd tracked wolves before, knew their loping grace, but this was alien, deliberate, the prints too heavy, too human in their stride. A metallic smell hung in the air, sharp and wrong, mingling with the damp scent of moss and pine, raising the hairs on his arms. He called out, "Dana," her friend's name lost to him, but the forest swallowed his voice, returning only silence, an unnatural hush that pressed against his ears. The tracks led away, erratic, zigzagging through the underbrush, and he followed, rifle in hand, senses straining, the trail a thread of broken branches and smeared mud. A mile in, he found her friend, a blonde woman in her late 20s, ID later naming her Karen Wells, sprawled in a small clearing, throat torn out, torso gashed by claws that left deep, ragged furrows, her eyes wide open, frozen in terror, staring at a sky she'd never see darken. He checked for a pulse, a formality, her skin cold, her body stiffening in the mountain chill. Her backpack lay shredded nearby, contents scattered. Maps, a water bottle, a torn journal, clawed apart as if something had rummaged with intent. The thumping came then, faint at first, a low rhythm from all directions, his pulse quickening as he scanned the tree line, fingers tightening on the rifle stock. It stepped out from behind a massive cedar, 30 yards away. 7 feet tall, gaunt yet muscular, covered in matted gray fur, its head wolf-like but grotesquely elongated, hands ending in long, curved claws that glinted in the fading light. Its mouth hung open, jagged teeth uneven, breath rasping in short bursts that sounded almost like laughter, a sound that turned his blood to ice. He fired, the first shot hitting its shoulder, jerking it back, but it barely flinched. The the second grazing its chest as it darted aside with mocking ease, vanishing into the trees. The smell of iron and wet fur lingered, a stench that coated his throat. The thumping returned, louder, and he realized it was his own heartbeat, a drumbeat of fear. Dana stumbled from the trees, pale, streaked with dirt, her eyes wild, words lost in her gasps. Then it was on her, leaping from a branch above, claws sinking into her shoulders, dragging her down. She screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the forest, thrashing as its jaws clamped her neck, the light fading from her eyes. Tobias fired again, hitting its side, but it didn't stop, looking at him with a cocked head, a snarl or grin twisting its face, then vanishing with her body into the trees. He followed the blood trail to a rocky outcrop, finding her remains, torn apart, scattered, and a pile of bones, some old, weathered, others fresh, human, slick with blood, a silent horde of the lost. He radioed for help, voice steady despite the chaos, waiting hours with the rifle trained on the tree line. The rescue team found him by the ravine, hollow-eyed, the remains undeniable, though they called it a bear, a mountain lion, anything but the truth he'd seen. The trails closed, traps set, but it was gone, a phantom in the Absarika's depths. Tobias quit weeks later, the wild no longer a refuge but a predator's lair. Evidence unearthed. Slashed tent, oversized tracks, a bone horde whispering of devoured souls. Would you answer the wild's call, listener? What would you find in its silence, or lose to its unrelenting hunger? These four tales, Elias in Michigan's shadowed pines, Alden in Minnesota's glassy lakes, the Surveyor in Indiana's hardwood hollows, Tobias in Montana's jagged peaks, span years and landscapes, yet converge in a single unshakable truth. The wilderness is no passive expanse. It watches, it hunts, leaving behind its relics. Bones piled in caves, tracks gouged into earth, screams swallowed by the trees. These men sought solitude, purpose, only to find a predator beyond naming, a shadow that defies the maps they carried, the reason they clung to. The wild is patient, eternal, its hollows echoing with the lost. Step lightly, reader, listener. It remembers your tread, and it hungers still.